Bore da, good morning. Croeso, welcome to Swansea and welcome to the People and Homes Conference for Shelter Cymru. Please welcome delegates in the room, but also welcome to our virtual delegates who are attending the conference online. I have to point out this is Shelter Cymru's first hybrid conference. If you are joining online and you have questions during the day, please use the chat box. And I'm pleased to say they will be raised by a member of the team, and I don't have to worry about the tech this morning, which is great news. I have to thank our sponsor, Wales and West Utilities, for making this day possible. And also, we are reducing our carbon footprint with a digital handbook. And if you haven't already got yours, the QR code is on the table in front of you. There is a limited number of paper copies at the front desk, and if you need one, and the schedule of the day is displayed at key locations around the conference area. Housekeeping, toilets are just off the main lobby. For in-person delegates, lunch will be served downstairs in the ground floor restaurant. And please thank you to Camless for sponsoring the lunch. There is no fire drill planned for today, so if you hear one, it is real. And we need to exit via the closest fire exit, and the assembly point is in the car park. So our main sponsor, Wales and West Utilities, will be hosting a fringe session during the lunch hour, highlighting their important work on energy safety, which will also be streamed online. And I would like to encourage you all to use the hashtag People and Homes, and please tweet during the conference. And for in-person delegates, there is open Wi-Fi throughout for you to access by entering your email address. And during the day, there are 2 breakout sessions. The first one is at 11:45 after the morning break. And details of each session can be found in the handbook. So for in-person delegates, if you haven't already done so, please sign the sheets next to the reception area. And for virtual delegates, you will be able to choose your breakouts when the time comes. So very warm welcome to you. I hope that you will agree that today's agenda is extremely interesting, and I'm particularly looking forward to hearing the speakers from our European counterparts, which will be very interesting sessions for you, I'm sure. So now to hand over to Mark Hodges from Shelter Cymru, and Mark is going to take us through the Slido voting. Over to you, Mark.
Morning, everybody. I am your light entertainment for this morning. You've got a whole 4 minutes of it. Enjoy. So I'm here to get you to do the Slido poll for us. I would like you, everyone in the room, get your phones out, get your QR scanners ready. On the back of our little things on each of the table, you will see a QR code for the live poll for this morning. We're going to ask you in 2 to 3 words what you're hoping to get from the day. Anyone who's joining us virtually, you should see this online by the powers of the internet. And we should see some results coming up. So we want some evidence-based improvements. And I forgot to say, keep it clean. Thank you. Meeting new people, absolutely. Oh, here they come. Inspiration. I was panicking then, folks. They send me out to do these bits, and just in case no one gets involved. Inspiration, networking, absolutely. There'll be plenty of opportunities for that. Knowledge. Oh, this is fantastic. Knowledge. Networking by far coming up as one of our favourite words for the day. Brilliant. Ideas, good practice. Connecting with peers. There's definitely a trend showing up here. Hopefully by the end of the day, where I pop up again, we'll also see a lot of people agreeing on what they're talking about. 8 more participants. Come on. If anyone's having trouble with scanning the QR code as well, you are able to visit slido.com, and there's a number just underneath it that you can type in so that you're able to access it. We don't leave anyone out in Shelter Cymru. Beautiful. And they're still coming. Okay. So on the whole, we're looking for learning and knowledge, we're looking at good practice, networking, job opportunities. I will say that there is a little piece of paper out there on the Shelter Cymru stand with some job opportunities in it, including on the training team. Just saying. Get that little dig in there as well, everyone. Brilliant. And I think I'm going to wrap it up here, because quite frankly, you don't deserve any more of me today. Bless you. I will be back, however, later this afternoon to do these again, to look at learning from the day and some additional bits and pieces that we will have gathered from the day. But thank you very much, everyone, for getting involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that light entertainment. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Julie James, the Minister for Climate Change. Just a little bit about Julie as an introduction. Julie's represented Swansea East in the Senedd since 2011. Oh, Swansea West, sorry. Hang on, let me do this. Julie has represented Swansea West, sorry about that, in the Senedd since 2011. Prior to that, Julie was a leading environmental and constitutional lawyer, and before that, she was Assistant Chief Executive at Swansea Council. She has had ministerial responsibility for housing issues since 2018 and has led us through a period of huge change and challenge, including the current cost of living crisis, as well as the pandemic, when Julie's leadership undoubtedly saved many lives. Please, can you give a warm welcome to the Minister?
Diolch yn fawr, Andrea. Thank you very much, Andrea. Close, but no cigar, as they say. One of the great things about Swansea, though, actually, is that we all represent Swansea, don't we? So it doesn't make any difference. We don't go in for artificial boundaries of that sort. It's nice and warm in here. Hope you're all feeling alert and whatever. I think we're going to stop the artificial aircon and open some windows as hopefully you'll all feel a bit more comfortable then. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Doesn't seem like very long ago since I was here last time either, so really a pleasure to see you all again. And it looks like a really good programme ahead of you today. I know that you're looking at how European colleagues are tackling homelessness and hearing about recent research from Shelter Cymru on reframing social behaviour and ending evictions into homelessness from social housing. So all things that we're really interested in hearing about as well. And I always really like the feedback from this conference, so it'll be really good to see that again this year. And of course, here in Wales, we've made enormous progress in ending evictions in this area, and I cannot say a heartfelt enough thank you to all of you who work with us to continue our commitment to stop evictions into homelessness from all our social housing providers here in Wales. And I'm absolutely certain that the research will build on what we already know, which is that antisocial behaviour comes from trauma and causes trauma and stress on individuals and families. And absolutely being evicted just makes the situation worse and doesn't address the underlying causes. So we know a managed move is far more beneficial for households, and I can absolutely assure you we'll continue to work with all of our partners to embed our good work as far as ending evictions into homelessness goes. I also understand the incredible pressure facing housing services, and that's why we really need to get ahead of it and get into prevention and helping people to sustain their tenancies. And that's really a key priority for us. As setting out in the Ending Homelessness Action Plan, prevention is not simply about housing. It's about ensuring all other services intervene to support people at an early stage to prevent them from ever facing homelessness. For prevention to truly work, it's so important for all public services to take positive action to help tenants avoid losing their home and support their engagement with services. It's also vital that comprehensive tenancy sustainment services are in place to respond proactively to issues as they arise to prevent homelessness in the first place. But I don't underestimate at all how challenging that is in the present environment and how difficult it is to focus on prevention in the face of what we're currently looking at on a day-to-day basis. Despite making considerable progress in taking forward actions towards our long-term goal of ending homelessness in Wales, I am acutely aware of all of the increasing pressures in the system. Our own monthly data demonstrates that housing and homelessness teams are facing increasing presentations, and I do want to thank all of you once again for your continued dedication and commitment to supporting people facing or experiencing homelessness. The level of demand is unfortunately continuing unabated. The figures speak for themselves, with over 10,000 adults and children currently living in temporary accommodation. The cost of living crisis means there are more people than ever who are accessing support and advice which they've never had to use before. It's been a year of relentless pressure on household budgets and the cost of delivering new homes, on the cost of owning homes, the cost of maintaining those homes, let alone improving them to meet the challenges of decarbonisation. But I will say that I'm still incredibly proud of Wales, the way that we pull together to find solutions and to get opportunities, even in the face of a pretty dire situation, has been incredible. So this year, the Team Wales approach has helped us welcome over 6,000 Ukrainians seeking sanctuary, as well as the pressure in the system for everything else. And it's something we should be very proud of indeed. It hasn't been possible elsewhere in the world, but we have done it here in Wales, and I am incredibly proud of that. We've also launched the Transitionary Accommodation Capital Programme in response to the additional pressure on housing and accommodation. We've invested almost 80 million in the last financial year to bring around 1,000 additional homes into use, and makes of investment in voids, acquisitions, refurbishment, and innovative use of modular and meanwhile site use. The programme is very much aligned with our efforts to ensure we're bringing every home we can into active use. And we announced an additional £50 million to support bringing empty homes back into use on top of that. And we've also continued to roll out Leasing Scheme Wales as well as making some changes to support the decarbonisation of homes coming into that scheme. And we've continued our efforts to support the building of new low-carbon social homes for rent, including working with the sector to provide additional support where cost inflation has been seriously impacting on delivery and viability. We've also not lost sight of the long-term change needed to end homelessness in Wales and the importance of hearing from those with lived experience to inform that change. So as part of our work to reform housing law in Wales, we've commissioned an expert review panel to make recommendations to the Welsh Government on where legislative change will help us to end homelessness. The work of the panel has been informed by over 300 people who have lived experience of accessing housing options and third sector services, and I'm so pleased that the work is grounded in the reality of homelessness. Key to those recommendations will be looking at the ongoing role of the wider public sector in identifying and preventing homelessness, and I hope that through this work we can strengthen and improve multidisciplinary collaboration to identify and prevent homelessness and joint work, which helps people to retain contacts and settle in a home where they can then go on to thrive and rebuild their lives. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank the expert review panel for their hard work to date and for the extensive engagement that has and continues to take place. I'm really looking forward to receiving the recommendations at the end of the summer, and we'll be publishing a white paper shortly thereafter. The longer-term legislative reform is, of course, a big part of our transformational shift towards prevention and rapid rehousing. Given the pressure we face in the housing system and the demand for temporary accommodation, I do recognise that we're not in a position to move entirely away from the use of temporary accommodation, including hotels and B&Bs, immediately. But that does not mean we should lose sight of our long-term vision. It may take us longer to get there, it will take us longer to get there than we wanted, but the end goal remains unchanged. Finding suitable and sustainable homes so that people can move into settled accommodation where they can live independent lives is absolutely fundamental and vital. As you will all know too well, the implications of being homeless are so much more than not having a home. It all too often means not having adequate access to healthcare, education and employment. All of this compounds and hampers a person's ability to function as part of society, impacts their resilience and directly affects the quality of life. And I think actually it affects the quality of everyone's life. I think if you live in a society that thinks that it's okay for people to be homeless, it actually affects the way you feel about the society you live in. Digressing from my sort of set speech for a moment, I recently visited London. I don't do that all that often these days. I have to say I was absolutely appalled. I mean, really appalled. And the fact that people have become so used to the fact that virtually every doorway has somebody looking hopeless in it. I mean, we have real problems here in Wales, but we haven't given up to the point where we just think it's fine to walk past people in the street. And I'm really proud of us for doing that, and I'm really proud of all of you for making that possible. It just would not have been possible if we didn't all believe in it. So, you know, we know it's important. We know it's part of being a civilized society, that people have a home to go to, they have a place to stay that's safe and secure. So that just emphasises, doesn't it, the importance of increasing prevention and moving to a rapid rehousing approach, which will enable us to reduce our dependency on this temporary accommodation that we have. We're also working really hard to phase out the use of poorer quality temporary accommodation, and in the longer term we want to make sure we develop the kind of housing which addresses the needs of everyone in our communities, which is why strategic long-term planning is important to ensure our response to homelessness is as robust as we would like it to be. So we're continuing to commit to this work and to work with our local authorities and wider partners to make the shift towards rapid rehousing. And rapid rehousing transition plans are being developed by the local authorities, and relationship managers are liaising closely with them to ensure and support the implementation, identify risk delivery, and recognise and share best practice. So, as I've said many times, and I'll say it again now, we are trying to ensure that we are as flexible as possible at the Welsh Government, and we want to fully utilise all our capital programmes to deliver more quality homes, because housing supply is, of course, the most critical element to rapid rehousing. And as I've said to lots and lots of you, if you've got a good idea, don't worry about the plumbing. You know, we saw this in the pandemic. You have a good idea, you tell us about it, and we'll try and sort the plumbing out for you behind the scenes. Rather than trying to find a programme yourself to fit your good idea into, just tell our teams or our relationship managers in the local authorities, and we will see if we can sort the plumbing out for you. Because that's how we managed in the pandemic, all of your good ideas, and we can do it again now for this continuing real, I mean, who knows how long this cost of living crisis is going to go on for. Those of you who were listening to the news this morning will have heard that the government has decided not to put a mortgage rescue process in place. So we're working hard here in Wales to see if we can do that, because we know that trying to keep people in their homes is the best solution. So again, if you've got bright ideas for how we might be able to do that, please, please come forward and tell us how to do it. So, you know, I make no apology for continuing to have an ambition to end homelessness in Wales. It's the right ambition to have, and despite the challenges over the last few years, we have and continue to make an enormous difference to everybody's life in Wales. You know, we started on this journey together. We've worked really hard together as a sector right through all of the challenges. We'll continue to work hard together despite the difficulties that we all face. And I cannot be prouder of all of you, really, in our shared ambition to ensure everyone in Wales has a decent, safe and affordable home. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Minister. So we'll now open up to questions. So we have roving mics, and we do have Welsh translation available if you need it. So can I ask anyone who's questioning to say who you are and who you represent? That would be very useful. So any hands?
I don't bite.
Yes? Wait for the mic. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, Alicja Zaleśnicka, Chief Executive, Tai Pawb. Thank you very much for this lovely introduction, Minister. It's fantastic to hear and celebrate the work of our colleagues in this room and beyond. Tai Pawb, alongside Shelter Cymru and CIH Cymru, as you well know, are part of Back the Bill campaign, campaigning now for a few years for housing to become human right in Wales. And we really welcome the publication of the Green Paper on fair rents and right to adequate housing in the last few weeks. We really welcomed your strong commitment to introducing the right in Wales, and given that strong commitment expressed and welcomed on many occasions, do you think that it features strongly enough in the Green Paper, which we think gives a lot of focus to fair rents at the moment.
Yeah, so that's a fair question, and I suppose it's partly because, you know, the reality of day-to-day politics in Wales is that the Labour government that I serve in is not a majority government, so we have to negotiate everything we do with another party, and you'll all know we have a cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru, although I don't know what's happening with the change of leaders, so watch this space. I'm sure that will become clearer this week where the new leaders' ambitions lie. So it's partly reflective of that, but it's very much reflective of what my continuing conviction that we have to do things in the right order. So I am very keen that when we introduce the right to adequate housing in Wales, it's actionable. So I want, you know, myself to be able to rock up to my local authority homeless service and say, where's my adequate house, please? Now, we know that most local authorities in Wales, no local authority in Wales would be able to do that right now. So we need to get that in. I understand that we could put an overarching right in that might drive it along as well. But in truth, we've got the capacity issue in the Senedd to look at as well. So I've just outlined to you that we're currently working flat out on getting the white paper on the homelessness reforms through. That will go into a bill next year. We're not quite halfway through the Senedd term, so in the third year of the Senedd term, we will start to look at that bill. All of you will be contributing to that, because I want a complete reform of homelessness legislation to match our ambition. And we need to put the resources in for local authorities to be able to do that and to harness all of the mental health and, you know, all the other support that we need. You know, I'll do an aside at this point in time and say that I absolutely understand that the housing support grant is not living up to expectation. This has been the worst budget round that I have ever faced in this job, or indeed in all the years I was in local government. The fact that we managed to maintain it at this previous level is no comfort to any of you in the room struggling with it, but was a battle in itself, quite frankly. If we can get more money into that, we will, because prevention and support services are really, really pivotal, but the budget is terrible. So the answer to your question is we're trying to do it sequentially. So we're trying to get the homelessness stuff in, and then the rent control stuff to go with renting homes and the adequate housing coming at the end of that. We're maintaining our programme to build the 20,000 homes. We're still on target for that. All of you will know quite how by a thread a lot of that is hanging, because inflation is cutting an absolute swathe through what our money will buy, but actually all of you have come together with really innovative solutions to that and so on. But the truth is that the right to adequate housing means that we have to build adequate housing. So I guess for me, it's about trying to line up all of the programmes to come to the right place. If we can get a bill in this Senedd term, we will. But what we will certainly be able to do is get a draft together, and then you guys can put a lot of pressure on all the parties to put that into their manifestos for the next Senedd term. So that's where I am with it. I know that, you know, other views are available, but that's the balance, the honest balance between the resource we have, the series of reforms we're making, and the situation we find ourselves in.
Thank you, Minister. Another questioner here, is it? No? Yeah.
Hello, Donald Lewis-Rowland from the Renters Reform Coalition Cymru. So you've just obviously outlined the legislative programme for the Senedd term. So are we then to expect that there'll be probably a 6-year delay from today, as it were, on any sort of renting legislation being enacted? And will that lead to another situation we had with the Renting Homes Wales Act, of that being delayed by 6 years again? Or what's going to be the situation this time around? And what's the plans of the Welsh Government, but also the Senedd, to make sure that we don't have that delay again? Because that delay absolutely devastated so many renting campaigns, and, you know, has set the programme back so many years. So what's going in place to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Yeah, so we've done a big lessons learned thing from renting homes, which I need about 5 hours to go through with you. But the fundamentals are, don't pass a framework act without having done all of the consequential work that goes with it, and without having to stress test some of the outcomes of such a fundamental reform. That was a very fundamental reform, and I don't think we quite understood quite how fundamental it was until we started to try and implement it. Many of you in this room, I recognise faces, have come forward with issues with it even now it is implemented. So we've put a lot more effort into, in the homelessness reforms, for example, making sure that we stress test them with the lived experience people, but also with all the lawyers, to say if this, then that, and to get all of what are called the consequential reforms in place and so on. It just takes much longer to put the bill in place in the first place, but I think it's worth it because it then can be implemented the second it's through the Senedd. With renting homes, it was deliberately done in first, and then we thought it would be a relatively quick time to implement it. It turned out to be, 7 years? Absolutely appalling. So we need to learn those lessons, and a lot of that is about the resource you put into it up front, hence my previous conversation about marshalling the resources. I'm not ruling out that we would get a renters bill in this year. I am ruling that out. This Senedd term, but I'm afraid it depends is a very good phrase here. So you'll know that we've got all the retained EU law stuff still rabbiting on. That's sucking resource all over the place. The brilliant gift that is Brexit is still sucking resource all over the Senedd. You guys might think it's finished. If you were in the legal services in the Senedd, you would know it is not. So, we've got to sort of calibrate it and get it right. But I would be very disappointed indeed if we couldn't get to the point where we had most of a draft bill agreed. You guys have already come up with some drafts for that. And if there is a draft bill that's more or less agreed, and we can get it into all the manifestos of the main parties. I mean, there's only 3 main parties in Wales. Then you've got a flying chance of it being part of a coalition agreement the other side. Wales has always had coalition government, so you need, if you can get 2 main parties to agree it, then why wouldn't it happen? But it is that upfront work that we need to do, and I'm really keen to make sure that we were doing it right now. We're not doing it. And we're keen to do it, but we have to do it right, don't we? And in the fluctuating housing market, which we have. And then I'll just segue into saying we've made a number of interventions in the housing market across Wales over the last year and a half. Many of you will know about those as well. So all the interventions around second homes, second home premiums, council tax. People are doing what's called an Article 4 carve out for the planning in parts of West Wales. Those are actually quite significant interventions in the housing market. We do need to have a look to see what's actually going to happen as a result of that. And we're also about to introduce a visitor accommodation registration and licensing scheme, which will look very much like Rent Smart Wales. The policy aim of that is to make it as hard to go into tourist accommodation as it currently is to go into private rented, because we don't want people to just think, I can't be bothered with the PRS, I'll let my house out to tourists for half the year and leave it empty. And we have the most ridiculous situation at the moment, don't we, with families who desperately need houses in hotels and B&Bs, and families going on holiday to houses. I mean, who would invent a system where that was the norm? It's bonkers. So we need to make sure that we recalibrate that. Why don't people go on holiday to hotels and bed and breakfasts anymore? Why do they want other people's houses to go on holiday to? What's going on with that system? So we've got a lot of other work going on in the Welsh Government to try and figure out how to do that. And we're in collaboration with a large number of international players there, because we are not alone in having a very beautiful country that then has a very large problem with second homes and tourist accommodation. So I just wanted to put that on the table because it's part of the bigger picture of what we're trying to do. And a large part of the scarcity of homes is because they're being used as holiday accommodation in large parts of Wales, and indeed where I live on Gower, that's happening in a large number of the villages there, and in other parts of Swansea it's starting to happen. So we need to recalibrate all of that at the same time.
Thank you, Minister. I think we've got time for one final quick question at the back, please.
Okay, this is a new one for Shelter Cymru. We've got a virtual question. So hello to Bex, who's out there and giving a question to us. She's talking about the opportunities that are missed by using existing properties to increase the social housing stock, and talking about the challenges local authorities face when trying to get planning permission, change of use and all that sort of thing. Is that being considered? The Minister just talked about wider work in terms of holiday accommodation. Are you also looking at what the existing housing stock can do to help us?
Yes, so we've got a big piece of work going on around permitted development rights and change of use. We're very keen, as I'm sure you all know, to get vacant space above shops used, for example, in city centres. That brings all kinds of benefits from footfall and vibrancy, as well as using up existing space. part of what we're doing in the transition accommodation programme is adapting the DQR so that it can be used in a longer term way. That's an ongoing discussion we want to have with you as the sector. I am not backing off from the DQR or the low carbon new build, right? So, you know, that's, if any of you want to argue with me about that, you'll have to see me outside, because that is a long argument. But, you know, when I started as housing minister, I got into all kinds of trouble for telling the volume house builders that they were building the slums of the future. But I was absolutely right, because already we're being asked to retrofit houses that were being built in 2018. It's ridiculous. Those people have a really bad life experience in houses that are inadequate, frankly. So, you know, I'm not backing off from that, but we do need a better transition arrangement. So this is about how do we calibrate the homelessness rules so that people in half-decent transition accommodation do still have the opportunity to move into proper social housing, properly built social housing, but are not in, you know, really appalling transitory accommodation. I don't know the answer to that. We're going to be asking all of you, you know, how do we calibrate that system correctly? Because of course we should be using all of those spaces, but they won't be at standard, will they? So what's the fix for that? So you probably know the answer better than I do. And that's the sort of thing that we need to calibrate into the legislation as well, so that we, you know, local authorities that are housing people in longer term temporary have the right set of tools to do that, and to make sure that people can still get onto the right housing eventually, even if eventually is longer than we would presently allow. So sorry, that's a very elaborate answer, but it's a complicated set of things to try and calibrate, isn't it?
Thank you, Minister. Can I just thank you for the opportunity, not just to come and speak to us today, but also to open up for Q&A, which is always very welcomed. Can we please give a warm thank you to the Minister?
Actually, Andrew, I'll just say to you as well, I'm very grateful for your chairmanship and leadership of the Housing Cabinet Members group, and I just should say to the wider room that we meet very regularly as a set of Housing Cabinet Members, and those kinds of liaisons are really, really important to us. We do that with other organisations as well. But if there's a group of you who feels we're not doing that, please do come forward. I'm very happy to make sure we're speaking to all parts of the sector.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ruth Power, CEO of Shelter Cymru, who is going to take us through setting the scene. Ruth has been CEO of Shelter Cymru for 3 years. Throughout her career, this is going to take a little while because she's got a very long career, so bear with me. She has enacted a commitment to social justice in various service delivery, policy and leadership roles in the third and statutory sectors. She started out in local authority and housing associations and homelessness services in Cardiff and London, and then set up and ran a women's refuge and a teenage mother and baby unit for a black-led housing association. After 5 years as London Director at Advice UK, she held national policy and commissioning roles in criminal justice. She worked with partners to improve housing, health and social care outcomes for prisoners, and received a national award for developing alternatives to custody. As Shelter Cymru CEO, she chairs Homes for All Cymru and sits on the Ending Homelessness National Advisory Board. Please give Ruth a warm welcome.
Thank you. You'll see that Julie and I got the memo about dressing colourfully. So hope that'll keep you awake in this hot room. Okay, let's just work out the slides. So we are here today to talk about the journey to ending homelessness, and it's probably worth saying a few things out loud from coming from the perspective of a campaigning organisation. As Andrew's mentioned, I've worked in various different sectors and various different roles. I really recognise that everybody in the room here is here because you share our commitment to ending homelessness. And while a lot has changed since I've done those various roles, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in any of those areas at this point in time, what it has done is given me an insight into the commitment, the different opportunities, the very different constraints that there are in different sectors as we seek to end homeless or tackle any other social issue. So I just wanted to say at the outset, really, my starting point is respect for the work that people do in their different roles. We're all coming at this from different angles. Shelter Cymru has got a bit of that jigsaw, and what I'm going to talk to you about is about the Shelter Cymru perspective. So I'm going to talk to you about whether or not we're on track to end homelessness in Wales, and talk a little bit about the national data and a little bit about the Shelter Cymru casework data, and then talk about the roadmap for Wales. So, the difficult question, and the Minister has helpfully, I suppose, said the figures speak for themselves. You know, it's a difficult question. Are we on track to end homelessness? We know where we are now in terms of the figures, in terms of temporary accommodation going the wrong way. Having said that, we welcome some of the initiatives that the Minister has set out, you know, moving closer to a universal approach in terms of ending homelessness by the extension of the priority need categories is very welcome. And we are active participants in the expert review panel that the Minister has also referred to too. So we're optimistic about those changes. But it is really important for all of us who are challenged by the task of ending homelessness at a point at which it's elevated to take on board that our task is taking place in a wider context. We've got COVID, we've got the cost of living crisis, but we already had a severely overstretched housing system. So some of the figures here related to social homes. Social homes are the only really large-scale option for homes that people can actually afford and are settled if they're not in a position to buy. So that sector is absolutely vital. And what we know is we've got almost 90,000 households waiting for social housing. That's equivalent to about 37% of the stock that we have in Wales of social homes. So that's problematic. And one of the knock-on effects of that is that it's pushed all kinds of households into the private rented sector. So families with young children, elderly people, disabled people, people on low incomes are getting pushed into a growing private rented sector. And what we know about the private rented sector is that competition is high for properties and rents are high. And we also know that not everybody is equally placed to enter that competition. So we know that from our report, Can I Get a Home? We know that discrimination operates in some parts of the private rented sector. And we also know from the work by the Bevan Foundation, for example, that rental properties at LHA rates are near extinct in Wales. So it's problematic. The heavy reliance on the private rented sector, it also means that we've got more and more people, as many of you will be very well aware, who are on the receiving end of no-fault evictions. And they struggle then to self-solve their homelessness because of the high competition for properties and because of the costs of rents being unaffordable. So this heightened reliance upon the private rented sector and its fallout was never an explicit policy choice. So the question we've got to ask ourselves now is whether we think that's okay. Our casework tells us that it's not okay because it's basically paying much more rent for much less security than somebody would get within a social home. So it's really important, as we think about ending homelessness, that we acknowledge we're working at a time of really heightened challenges and that exacerbation of that wider housing context. More optimistically, what we've always known, and what this data points to here, is that housing, health and inequalities are inextricably linked. And we believe that there is a real opportunity to have joined up cross-government strategy that puts homeless right up there on the policy agenda in the same way that health is. So these are some stats from the Ministry of Justice on possessions during the period from 2019 to March 23. And they relate to county court bailiff possessions, where, for example, people get their locks changed and the likely outcome is homelessness for the household. So you can see there this blue line, which is the unprecedented levels of possessions within the private rented sector, many of you will be feeling the pressures as a result of that. And then you'll see, meanwhile, that social landlords, this brown orangey line here, social landlords, and mortgage repossessions below that, have largely stayed at below our 2019 levels. And that reflects this orange line, real restraint by social landlords, which we really welcome in terms of the pressures that are on households at the moment. And the reason why the mortgage figures are still very low, bumping along the bottom there, is because that lag effect in the cost of living crisis, there will be a lag between people falling off that cliff edge in terms of needing to remortgage, for example, and it'll take some time to feed through into data. So just to say a little bit from the perspective of our services in that sort of wider context. So the challenges that I've touched on are mirrored in our services. We've got 3 main service areas which are supported by a mixture of Welsh Government and other funding. We run housing advice surgeries and court duty service, Pan Wales, for people who are facing possessions. We've got the Shelter Cymru Live service, which is our phone and web chat service, again operating Pan Wales. We've got Advice Online, which is a web-based information resource and provides tools for people to sort of deal with their housing issues without seeing an advisor. So last year, Shelter Cymru helped 1 in every 133 households in Wales, which is a phenomenal figure. And that's just the people that we had the capacity to meet their need. That does not tell you about the full extent of need in Wales. One of the things that we are really mindful of, and I guess you are too, is the way that need has changed, and the way that people present has changed. So that pandemic trend of people presenting with more complex issues has continued, and that we've seen that clients' well-being, particularly their mental health, has deteriorated. Distress itself has been identified as a trend within our Shelter Cymru Live service. We're raising more safeguarding concerns as well in relation to our clients. And at the same time as all that, what our caseworkers tell us is that it's becoming much harder to access mental health services and other support services that are absolutely essential. They are key partners in ending homelessness. So just to look at our Advice Online service, so that's a channel of service delivery which is not capped really by resource, so that we can help more people without incurring any extra resource. These are the top 5 most visited pages. That tells its own story about the cost of living crisis. And what we've seen in the first quarter of 2023 is an increase of 40% in the unique visits that we've had to our Advice Online pages. So that's 205,000 visits just in that quarter seeking information of this kind. Just to say a little bit about our casework. So homelessness, you'll see this top line here, see a real spike there since January, that our casework in that area has shot up. It's fair to say that the difference between our very bold and groundbreaking homelessness legislation in Wales and the experiences of some of our clients does persist. Over the year, we do know that hundreds of people have been sat on temporary accommodation waiting lists across Wales. And that sometimes means that people are forced to stay in conditions that are unsafe, very unsuitable, and sometimes on the street. The reason for that is that local authorities simply don't have sufficient temporary accommodation in order to be able to accommodate the level of people in need. And I'm saying that not to criticise any partners, simply to acknowledge that that is the position of our clients. And we know that local authorities too are kind of concerned about that level of unmet need. It's well recognised that there's a revolving door of homelessness for people who may have a range of unmet needs, and for people who particularly struggle in the shared accommodation setting and with the restrictions that they might have in some temporary accommodation. And that can result in some people going into temporary accommodation and bouncing back out fairly quickly, and sometimes ending up back on the street. And without more tools in our armoury to tackle those issues, and without pooling our learning and sharing some of those challenges together, and looking at solutions like Housing First and scaling those up, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to reverse that trend. And that's something that really concerns us, and we're keen to work with others on. And then just briefly, this orange line is our no-fault evictions line. That was 20% of our work last year, was as a result of no-fault evictions. Again, links back to that heavy pressure that we see on temporary accommodation and our over-reliance on the private rented sector. And then the final 2 lines tell the story of our casework and show a sort of gradual rise in our casework in relation to rent arrears, which is the blue line around rent arrears and rent levels. And then lastly, mortgages, again, showing that same lag that I mentioned earlier, where we have got a doubling in demand over approximately a 2-year period, but the figures still remain relatively low. The Minister was talking earlier about you know, the position that we've found ourselves in and sort of some of the kind of the challenging realities, really. We kind of all have been sort of swimming against the tide, really, in terms of our efforts to end homelessness. She also set out, you know, a whole range of policy initiatives that we really welcome. You know, and we've also seen some really good examples of partnership working. We've got workshops here today that focus on some of that partnership work and some of the excellent work that's happening. But despite our collective best efforts, it is really hard for us all to acknowledge that the figures are rising. And we, as I say, we need to understand that in the context of that deepening housing emergency, which is a context in which we're all working hard. In terms of rapid rehousing, which the Minister mentioned, you know, it's kind of one of the sort of flagship policies in terms of Welsh Government and running along parallel alongside the focus on prevention, which we really welcome. Rapid rehousing kind of is an approach, for those that are not familiar with it, that tries to ensure that anybody experiencing homelessness can move to a settled home as quickly as possible, rather than spending an extended period in temporary accommodation. So at a strategic level, you know, what the earlier slides are showing us really is that we will need to allow housing supply, but also allocations, if we are going to meet the needs of homeless people and see the results that we all desire. But at this quite early stage of thinking about rapid rehousing and conceptualising what it is and how it will work in Wales, it's probably worth us reflecting a little bit on the kind of the interrelationship that we see potentially between prevention and rapid rehousing. We had a webinar last autumn where local authorities were telling us about how they are reconfiguring their services to increase that focus on prevention. We also hear examples of local authorities who are working really closely with their HSG-funded services to enable people at risk of homelessness to move to a new tenancy without ever going into temporary accommodation. Arguably, that's rapid rehousing. So whether we define interventions like that as rapid rehousing or whether we define them as prevention, what it highlights is there are already examples of local authorities problem solving, working really flexibly to get the right outcomes for individuals and to get them into homes as soon as possible. And critical to that, we would argue, is advice and support, and whether that's specialist housing advice to prevent an eviction or whether that's HSG-funded support, which is supporting people as they move through the system and helping them stay within that system and not fall out of the system. We would argue that that partnership between local authorities and the third sector is absolutely key to ending homelessness. Briefly, obviously, ending homelessness prevention, it's a good news story for everybody. It works at a human level, it works at a financial level, and those are just some brief examples of the savings that can be accrued as a result of adopting a proactive, preventative approach. So just to move on to the roadmap in terms of ending homelessness. We recently visited a FIANSA European conference to share the experiences of Wales in terms of ending homelessness. And one of the things that did was act as a really good reminder for the assets that we have in Wales, because we can't take those for granted. And foremost amongst that, I would say high ambition. So actually there is tremendous, you know, we've heard it today, political ambition to end homelessness in Wales. There is a strong prevention focus in our legislation. There is innovation in policy, in practice. We've got third sector, statutory and academics who are kind of working at the cutting edge in terms of ending homelessness. And we've got a really widely shared commitment to social justice in Wales, which is a really fundamental enabler and supporter of the work that we need to do. We've also got really strong cross-sector partnerships, and those partnerships have shaped the Ending Homelessness Action Plan that Julie James referred to, and they're also now supporting its delivery. The Minister mentioned reduction in evictions from social housing. There's been a 72% reduction in evictions from social housing in 4 years. That's phenomenal. You know, so that partnership and the willingness to adopt new approaches is evidenced in data. And more recently, we are in the process of putting homelessness at the heart of a new National Health Inclusion Network for Wales to look at improving health outcomes for people who are homeless and the health contribution to ending homelessness. So, in terms of what we need to do to move forward, What I'm not going to do is to dwell on what sits in the middle here, because the Minister has talked about a lot of this, about those medium-term policy interventions. What I'm going to focus on is what is the first stop, and then some longer-term work. So in a cost of living crisis, our first priority is clearly to keep people in their homes. We've a series of recommendations for Welsh Government, and we recommend strongly that Welsh Government invest further in HSG funding services. We recommend more investment in the Discretionary Homelessness Prevention Fund and in discretionary housing payments. The Bevan Foundation have just published a report which sets out a clear approach in terms of discretionary housing payments. We believe this flexibility at the front line is what will really help us to intervene proactively, creatively, quickly to end homelessness. We also would like to see a baseline of mortgage rescue and rent rescue support across Wales, and we would like to see those barriers to flipping private homes into social homes reduced as quickly as possible, so we can bring more homes into social ownership. For some years, we've been campaigning in terms of the longer-term view. Alicia asked a question earlier about the right to adequate housing. We're with CIH Cymru and Tai Pawb. Shelter Cymru is working on the campaign to a right to adequate housing. That campaign started back in 2018, and it tries to get recognition in Welsh law for the internationally recognised right to adequate housing. Since last year's conference, Welsh Government has issued a green paper. We've also completed a cost-benefit analysis, independently commissioned from Alma Economics, undertaken with a robust Treasury methodology, and that demonstrates the benefits, the cross-government benefits, which would come from investing in a right to adequate housing. For every pound invested, there would be a £2.30 return. It makes a strong economic case, which complements the moral case, our moral view, that it's time for radical reform and to really recognise that housing is a human right. Contrary to what the Minister suggested, a new law doesn't mean that we expect people from the day that law comes in to be able to rock up in a local authority and demand a home. That's absolutely not what it sets out. What it does is it strengthens the foundation for ending homelessness. So it commits government to a step change. It signals that Wales will no longer tolerate leaving a good home to the accident of the market. It hardwires a duty, not just on the current government, but on future governments, to systematically plan and make progress year on year until we reach the end goal, which is that everybody in Wales has a good home. Critically, what we feel within the campaign, and again, different to the Minister's view, is we feel that it will push homes and homelessness up the policy agenda in Wales. And we feel that's needed. It will require government to have strategies beyond the Senedd term, a long-term strategy to align housing supply across all tenures with the current needs and the future needs of Wales. It will drive a long-term investment alongside that strategy, an ability to plan for the long term. And one of the arguments that we often use within the campaign is that in building the NHS, we didn't wait until the doctors, the nurses, the hospitals were all in place before making that commitment to deliver. In 21-22, housing was just 2.8% of the Welsh Government budget. I find that really shocking. It simply doesn't reflect what we know about homes in terms of its centrality in our lives. And so at a time of pressure on public finances, and because of this cost benefit, we absolutely think it's the right time to invest in a paradigm shift, to invest to save, to invest in a fairer, much more resilient housing system. So if we enter future housing crises, we are in a stronger point. Doing that won't just realise the benefits that are on this slide over time in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, and it won't just further advance the progress that's already being made towards net zero, but it's also a really key enabler for ending homelessness. So after that, I was just going to briefly, after that sort of high-level view, just briefly share a kind of an individual story of ending homelessness to kind of ground our conversation, really. This is from one of our service users who, since moving to his first settled home, our client says his quality of life is vastly improved. He values the simple things that he couldn't do in his temporary accommodation. putting washing on the line, chatting to neighbours, having somebody in for a cuppa. He reports a huge difference in his mental health. His anxiety is reduced. He no longer relies upon his long-term sleeping medications. Since he got a home, he says he sleeps like a baby. So thanks very much for listening, and I'm hoping today will give us all time to draw breath from the challenges that we all face in our day jobs, to reflect, to question and to learn and to think afresh together. I'm expecting to be really inspiring, particularly by partners in Europe who can show us that ending homelessness is within our gift. And with the assets that I set out that we have here in Wales, not least that strong cross-sector partnership way of working, we can end homelessness and we will end homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ruth. Very inspiring and thought-provoking indeed. Okay, so we're going to take you now to the report launch, Reframing Antisocial Behaviour, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jenny Bibbings and Jonathan Clode from Shelter Cymru. They will present the key findings and recommendations from the new report, which calls for a trauma-informed approach to preventing homelessness due to behaviours deemed antisocial. Over to you both.
Diolch, Andrea. Bore da bawb. It's lovely to see so many friends and colleagues here today and joining us online as well. I'm not going to be speaking for very long because it's Jonathan that's done all the hard work here, not me. But I just wanted to just to say a few words by way of context at the outset. So this piece of work is very much a response to Shelter Cymru's changing casework in social housing possession. You've heard Ruth and the Minister this morning talk about the huge impact that we've seen in Wales over the last 4 to 5 years in the movement to end evictions into homelessness from social housing. 72% reduction in evictions over 4 years. And certainly from Shelter Cymru's experience, the casework looks so very different these days. We see a lot less social tenants needing our help. And when we do see social landlords in court on those much rarer occasions, we find that they're always really open to conversations about negotiating, trying to save a tenancy, putting repayment plans in place. They're open to trying to keep people in their homes right up until the last minute. So it really is a very different working environment. The cases that we still see now, if I can just share a few observations with you about what the casework looks like these days. As I said, it's a much smaller number of cases. Lots of antisocial behaviour in the mix. There are some very high rent arrears, possession cases as well. And when I say high rent arrears, it's not the kind of the statutory definition of serious rent arrears. We're often talking, sometimes tens of thousands of pounds. So the cases themselves are much more acute in nature and complex. We have observed that there's a lot of unmet support need among the social tenants who we continue to see, particularly among those who are looking at eviction due to antisocial behaviour. Sometimes people are really vulnerable, and sometimes it's to the extent that capacity is under question. So there is, and these support needs haven't always been identified, still less actually addressed. So there's a real theme of vulnerability there. Another observation is that, and we haven't been able to put a figure to this, but we have observed that in at least a small number of cases, homelessness has still been the outcome, despite, it has to be said, despite the best efforts of all the parties involved. And as I say, we haven't been able to put a number to that, but there are some case studies in the report which you can have a look at. So there's a number of themes there. And I think the other thing to point out as well is that, and this is an observation from Shelter Cymru casework, which of course, the casework is not necessarily a representative sample of problems across Wales, but it is a Wales-wide picture nonetheless. And we have observed that there are quite a few social landlords' names who just never appear in the casework. So that raises a question, okay, well, what are they doing that others aren't doing? And so for us, that's what this piece of work is aiming to do. It's getting under the skin of the casework and asking, okay, why are people actually having to use our services? What's really going on here? What are the root causes that are causing people to need our services? What are the opportunities to perhaps prevent things getting to the stage that it has? Where are the prevention opportunities? And also, who's doing it really well? What's the good practice out there? Because, you know, those landlords who we don't see, what are they doing? So there's a question there about learning and culture change and how that happens across Wales. So that's what we're aiming to do with this report. I'm going to hand over to Jonathan to talk through the findings. Yeah, those are the questions that we set out to ask in the research. And I should say, before I do anything else, is that you can get the report yourself if you go onto our Twitter feed, is probably the best way. It's on the Shelter Cymru website, in the policy library, but have a look at the Shelter Cymru Twitter feed, and there's a link there to the report. You can download it yourself. There is a Welsh version in production at the moment and an exec summary in production, but you can see the full English report today. Do have a look. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Jonathan, and then I'm going to come back at the end briefly for just to take you across the recommendations.
Thank you. Bore da, everyone. It's nice to finally be able to share this report with you all. We've been working on it since July last year, so it's nice to finally get it out there. So, as you can see, the research questions are: what does best practice look like in prevention of homelessness due to behaviours deemed antisocial? How can we address variability in responses across Wales and embed best practice? And is it time to reassess how we conceptualise ASB in light of what we've learned in Wales about trauma and how to work in trauma-informed way? So I'll just quickly skirt through the methodology that we used in putting the report together. So a policy and practice review, a literature review, lots of good practice of existing projects supporting tenants who are displaying ASB, a review of social landlords' websites across Wales, that was every single social landlord, interviews with stakeholders, so that included RSLs, local authorities, leads on community projects, support services, and people who've been through the experience of being accused of antisocial behaviour, and of course, as Jenny was saying, casework examples from Shelter Cymru legal team. So before we go into the actual research findings and the themes of those findings, I thought it might be worth reminding ourselves of what the definition of antisocial behaviour actually is. So as you can see there, behaviour by a person which causes or is likely to cause harassment, alarm or distress to persons not of the same household as the person. But what does that really mean? What does that include? So it includes, but is not limited to, intimidating gatherings of people in public, vandalism, graffiti, dealing and buying drugs on the street, fly tipping, antisocial drinking and misuse of fireworks. But if we're thinking more broadly, ASB is not necessarily fixed by the acts of the perpetrator, but also by the effect that can have on a community. And another thing to consider is that antisocial behaviour is often very much a question of perspective. We'll touch on this a little bit more later, but that perspective is defined by the situation in which the person is observing it. So looking at our Shelter Cymru casework, we did a study of 30 possession cases for ASB that ran throughout 2022 from social landlords. 59% of those cases involved tenants with very complex needs who were not receiving adequate or timely support either for themselves or for a member of their family. The cases included 14 different social landlords, so that was 11 housing associations and 3 local authorities. 16% of those possession orders were made by one single housing association and 26% were made by a single local authority. So by conducting a review of social landlords' websites across Wales, so that was 36 housing associations and 11 local authorities, we were able to consider the level of publicly available information regarding organisational ASB policies and the advice for tenants experiencing ASB and their reporting procedures. In particular, we were looking at the extent to which trauma-informed approaches in landlords was being used in their policies. So the level of web-based information available to tenants on a landlord's approach to ASB varied quite a bit across the landlords. We found that 80% of social landlords across Wales provided details of the approach to ASB on their webpage. Housing association websites tended to be more likely to contain information compared to local authorities. The full ASB policy document was made available by only 17% of landlords, and again, this was more likely to be the case for housing associations than local authorities. The documents that we looked at ranged in publication from around 2016 to late 2022. Overall, it was really good to see that ASB policies aimed towards working preventatively and were focused on ensuring evictions for ASB were rare and the very last resort. Pardon me. So ASB can have a profound effect on the victim, and that should never be trivialised. But to focus solely on the needs of the victim is to ignore the wider issue of root cause. Our review of the ASB policies found that the information published on social landlords' websites was largely focused on the victim and the reporting procedure. In some cases, there was a detailed breakdown of what constitutes antisocial behaviour and what the process of investigation would be once a complaint had been made. Some sites just had an online form to complete with no other details. In the cases where trauma-informed approaches were referenced, there was information relating to mediation, and an effort was made to make a potential complainant aware of the fact that an alleged perpetrator might be displaying ASB as a result of a wider support need, and that they would endeavour to help with that. Some websites displayed outdated information that related to reporting ASB in the contents of the lockdown periods during the pandemic. Obviously, the impact of the pandemic saw a rise in ASB complaints across the housing sector, but landlords we spoke to felt this was due to people spending more time in proximity to one another, at a time when their stress and anxiety levels were likely to be very high and their tolerance very low. This is subsequently levelled out, but it is likely that awareness of one's neighbours and their behaviour is heightened, where previously those observations would have been quite fleeting. In our interviews with stakeholders, we heard acknowledgement that ASB is often the consequence of a more serious concern that has escalated due to a lack of any support or an effective intervention. The key issues of ASB, such as noise complaints, littering and overcrowding, they're obviously all contributory factors in ASB allegations, but the common unifying factor across every landlord we spoke to was the overriding mental health needs of the alleged perpetrator. The presentation of ASB can be triggered by a particular circumstance or a stress response, but why a person behaves in a way that they do may be seen as antisocial is often due to an unmet support need relating to past trauma and ongoing mental health issues. This distinction was felt to be of particular importance when it came to moving away from punitive responses where behaviour was seen as the driving force for sanctions, as opposed to concern over a person's well-being in their current situation. It was acknowledged by stakeholders that historically housing officers have been largely responsible for collecting rent, ensuring tenants fulfil the responsibility of their tenancies. They're not support workers, they're not mental health professionals, and their roles haven't traditionally focused on that specialist kind of support. Our discussions with landlords confirmed some excellent examples of changing culture and good practice examples of housing service teams that were being restructured and their roles refocused to enable a merger of housing management and support roles. I'll just give you briefly one example of a housing association that no longer employs staff specifically to deal with ASB, and instead they've created a more generic housing support officer roles, and they deal with much smaller patches where they've reduced their size from 600 to about 250. These officers are now more able to provide holistic support to the residents on their patch area, dealing with housing and tenancy management issues as well as ASB in the event things escalate to that point. Now, I should mention that there are countless good practice examples of community partnerships, working with the police, working with bespoke support services, but there just isn't the time to go through them today. So please have a look at the report, as Jenny said, and you'll see them all in there. Our interviews highlighted that historically, when issues have arisen around someone's tenancy, housing staff have resorted to processes such as issuing notices alongside payment plans and threats of injunctions. Many people acknowledge that elastic tolerance and a higher threshold around the types of issues that would typically lead to enforcement has led to much better outcomes for tenants. The managers we spoke to cited that housing staff who were empowered to become more support-focused and avoid portioning blame felt they were much better able to get to know their tenants and communities and favoured a less transactional approach. One local authority landlord felt that supporting tenants in social housing demanded a level of pragmatism in their approach to ASB, as invariably any eviction would possibly create a homelessness presentation. In 2022, they'd only carried out 5 evictions, and they felt this was a result of a more individualised approach and a conscious intention to avoid legal action and instead put the onus on resolution. Shelter Cymru case notes involving a tenant who'd been accused of ASB noted that they felt the label of being antisocial made them feel undeserving of help, and they consequently withdrew from the landlord's attempts to communicate with them. Engagement too often can be service-led. Stakeholders stated that they were supporting people with a variety of issues, some of which are incredibly complex and have a profound impact on their capacity to manage their lives. However, it was felt that in some cases, the methods of communication they were using just weren't effective, and the efforts to engage with tenants could be limited to letters that were punitive in their tones. These approaches have tended to be more likely to create barriers and make the potential for working with a tenant that much more difficult. Working holistically often means having to think beyond the typical professional relationships between tenants and housing staff. The tenant may see the housing staff as an authority or an enforcement figure. They might have even developed more positive relationships with other people within that organisation. So where possible, using these relationships to support tenants can be a valuable means to develop good two-way communication. Perhaps the most significant issue stakeholders expressed was an ongoing concern around limited and untimely access to health services, particularly mental health care. For some, the potential to meet a person's support needs was just deemed unrealistic, though it was felt that a lot of the issues being presented could be prevented that much sooner if it was there at the point people were ready to engage with the support. It was felt that the NHS and statutory mental health services could have greater agency in relation to housing and more co-partnership working when it comes to housing support. We were also told that housing staff often felt ill-equipped to deal with increasing mental health needs of their tenants and don't always feel confident in signposting people to the right help. I'll give you a brief case study of ours. We'll call this lady Janet for the sake of the case study. So Janet lived in a local authority property and was subject to a possession order due to accusations of ASB. This related to noise issues in her flat that were upsetting her neighbours. Janet had a history of mental health issues, ACEs, and a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. In the period during which the complaints were made, Janet's community psychiatric nurse had left her post and she hadn't been replaced. The only support she had was from her social worker, who she didn't have a very good relationship with. Janet felt as though she had no purpose, had made multiple suicide attempts, and her only positive relationship was with her mum. After working with the community psychiatric team, the possession order was removed and an injunction was put in its place. Janet has since complied with the injunction and is waiting to be moved into alternative accommodation with more support. Okay, so we often hear about meaningful partnership working, but what does that really mean? Well, to the people we spoke to, it meant developing links with community services, such as working alongside police, youth services, environmental health, mental health and harm reduction services, all of which they felt were vital if they were going to help people with support needs to stay in their homes. Often people leave support services to take on a tenancy and find themselves in a position where they have little or no support. Having a home, as we would all agree, is vital to a person's well-being, but it is not in and of itself the solution to everyone's troubles. Housing staff are vital in being able to identify the underlying reasons behind ASB, and without meeting their support needs, the issues are likely to continue, and that can lead to displacement. A co-partnership approach to problem solving means working together to recognise the specialisms of all the agencies, and having a holistic approach to support has proven extremely effective among all the landlords that we spoke to. So, reframing antisocial behaviour. The use of language in how antisocial behaviour issues are communicated to tenants can have a significant impact on the potential to work with a person and meet their support needs. Several landlords told us they've changed their terminology so that the victim has now become the complainant, and they've also revised the format and delivery of their communications to avoid punitive terms. It was felt that the way someone's alleged behaviour was communicated could actually re-traumatise them, and that to be accused of ASB is a major stigma and one that will stick. If a tenant is generally perceived as a problem to the people in the best position to help them, they're significantly less likely to engage with any mitigation process. Seeing ASB as a symptom of a larger issue is integral in the pursuit of a trauma-informed approach. ASB may actually be a person's coping mechanism or stress response and point to a wider issue related to unmet support needs. But it's also worth noting that ASB is not always a stress response, but a case of perception related to individual social norms. The context can define the ASB and have a significant impact on its effect. Antisocial drinking, or rowdy or nuisance behaviour, are both defined as ASB by the Welsh Government Association, but they'll vary depending on the setting in which they're observed and reported. In many cases, perceived ASB could be down to individual lifestyle choices, and disagreements are going to arise over differing opinions on how someone chooses to live their life. Organisations such as Platform and RAP advocate for putting relationships at the centre of support provision. By doing so, problems and risks can be framed in relation to a person's history and trauma, as opposed to reacting to specific behaviour that is likely to have been compounded by the experience of going through the homelessness system, being in temporary or supported accommodation, or even going through an eviction. This is a cycle that we can break if we choose to look beyond the labels. Restorative approaches focus on building, maintaining and repairing relationships. The Wales Restorative Approaches Partnership works with 30 different housing providers, registered social landlords, care homes and ASB teams. One of the keys in the success of this approach is to also work with tenants and train them on restorative approaches. The feedback we've had is that the most effective models are when staff and tenants train together and seek to problem solve early. So, to conclude, the term antisocial behaviour is in itself problematic. It's an umbrella term applied to a variety of behaviours, all of which vary greatly in presentation and have a number of complex root causes. Labelling someone as a perpetrator of ASB leads to an instant judgment that can have detrimental implications in relation to how that person is perceived, particularly among support services. Applying labels makes it much more likely that services will resort to processes designed in response to the application of those labels, leading to more prescriptive, generic, and in many cases punitive interventions. Taking the focus away from the term antisocial behaviour would mean having to acknowledge the particular issues being presented and lead to a more thoughtful approach where a person receives support on the basis of their need at that specific time, as opposed to a response to an allegation of antisocial behaviour. By reframing ASB as a symptom of unmet support need, we'll be better able to give tenants a voice that isn't just sought when something has gone wrong, but rather heard at a time that empowers them to be and remain part of a community in a settled home, with access to support that they need and will continue to get it. In this way, we can build towards stronger and more inclusive communities across Wales. So I'll hand you back to Jenny now and she'll talk you through the recommendations.
Cheers, Jonathan. How are we doing for time, Chair? Just a few minutes. I'm not going to do it line by line because you can all read the report and understand the recommendations in detail there. I'm just going to pick out some of the key ones. So our main recommendation is we've asked the Welsh Government to produce a new housing management standard which would apply to all the social housing on homelessness prevention. So there's already one for ASB. It's pretty old. It shows its age if you read it, and it's not really used anymore. So, but rather than just producing like for like and running the risk of staying in that kind of pigeonhole way of thinking, what we would like to see is a wider standard which looks across the whole of homelessness prevention and looks at all of the learning that social landlords have put into practice over the last 5 years, bringing it all into one place. We think that'd be a really positive way of cementing the progress that we've had in Wales towards ending evictions into homelessness. There's a couple of other recommendations in there with a similar aim of supporting the movement. It won't surprise you, there's one about data. There's always a recommendation about data, but it is really important. Welsh Government used to collect and publish evictions data broken down by landlord, and they stopped it in 2010, 2011. And it is a really important part of the picture, not only because of scrutiny in the use of public money, but it's also useful for providers to be able to benchmark themselves against their peers as well. So it is an important component of culture change that we collect and publish that evictions data again. There's another one in there which might be a little bit more controversial, but let's see what you think. There's a question in there about possession grounds. So if we are now in a position in Wales where there is a vanishingly low number of people who were evicted into homelessness from social housing, should we actually reflect that in terms of social landlords' possession powers? So should a court in Wales have the ability to potentially refuse to make an outright possession order if the court judges that homelessness is likely to be the outcome? So that's a question that I'll let you chew on. There's a whole theme in the recommendations, it won't surprise you again to hear, about multi-agency working and about how health can come to the table. We're recommending that the Welsh Government, when they're looking at the new mental health strategy, that homelessness prevention is a thread through that, and that we're fully recognising homelessness prevention as a mental health intervention. And there's a number of recommendations in there which are really all aimed at helping local authorities to get the partners round the table at the local level, because there are some great examples in Wales where local authorities have managed to get health and police and probation and local education services, and all of them working at actually quite an operational level. It's not overly strategic. Sometimes it's about case conferences, getting round the table and working out who's best to work with this individual, what are their needs, how can we best meet those needs. So there's some great examples of that already happening in Wales, but these examples are really where they're working. It's been, it's the same old story. It's charismatic, proactive individuals swimming against the tide, really, to force people around, to get that good practice in happening. So we need to make a more conducive environment for that multi-agency working. I think I'm just going to pick up on one more recommendation as well, which is about support. And specifically, it's about holistic, intensive ASB preventative support services. We're lucky enough to have a few of these in Wales, and there is a strong evidence base in what works actually when it comes to preventing antisocial behaviour at the family level. We're lucky enough to have one right here in Swansea. Pobble run a family intervention project, and if you have a look online, their outcomes are really good. They've been going for more than 10 years. They've worked with more than 300 households, and in 10 years they've had 0 evictions. They have had some managed moves, but they've kept a lot of people in their homes, and they've had 100% success at reducing and eliminating antisocial behaviour. And it's not the only example of projects that are achieving those amazing outcomes. We used to run one ourselves in Shelter Cymru called the Valleys Inclusion Project in the Caerphilly area. There is a strong evidence base in what works in providing support to address antisocial behaviour at its root. But these kinds of services are not commissioned anywhere near consistently enough. So there's a recommendation there for local authority, housing support grant commissioners to look at the evidence, because we need more of these projects around Wales. The other recommendations I'll invite you to have a look at in the report. I'm very happy to continue the conversation over the course of the day. Thank you for listening. Diolch.
Thank you both, and particularly thank you to Jonathan for an excellent report. We're going now to go to a discussion panel on how we can prevent homelessness due to ASB. So if I could invite the panel members to come to the stage. So we have Sarah Skyer, Platform, Natalie Taylor, Valleys to Coast Housing Association, Superintendent Tony Williams, South Wales Police, and Julia Holston-Clark, Restorative Wales. So if you can come to the panel in the front here, and what I'm going to do is invite the panellists in the first instance to speak for 2 to 3 minutes to introduce their initial thoughts on the report. And once they've finished speaking on that, I'll come back to the stage and open it up for questions. Over to you.
Me? Bore da, thank you all. I think as I was sat on the end, I think I've drawn the short straw to go first. Yeah, thanks Jenny and Jonathan for my presentation. Yeah, I'm Natalie from Valleys to Coast Housing. And I think I know it's already been said today, but what the report highlighted for me was that for us as social landlords, we should celebrate how far we've come in changing our approach to how we deal with ASB. Yes, the pandemic halted the legal action, but we haven't returned to the levels that we were pre-pandemic, when the pressures on us are increasing and we're seeing greater numbers of our customers falling into crisis. In terms of the recommendations, I agree that a broader guidance on housing management standards would be better than the previous focus on ASB alone. But these standards need to be achievable in practice and meaningful, and not just a tick box exercise. Also have no issue in and supporting the transparency of reporting our figures on evictions to Welsh Government, and the reasons why. I think we need to learn from each other as to why that happens. And with the other recommendations, what screams out to me is that neither social landlords, local authorities, health services or other support services have enough funding as it stands, or resources to truly embed these principles and make them sustainable. People need support for as long as they need it, and that costs money. We're all still working in crisis, and I can only speak for my own organisation, but we are doing everything we can to ensure our customers remain in their home, and that's really tough. We've had training from RAP, and for me, I found that really transformative, and we've been looking at alternative ways with dealing with ASB, such as we meet with complainants and perpetrators in places that are comfortable to them, rather than us dictating where we should meet with people. We've looked to restructuring our teams. Simple things like we've removed the officer title from our roles, our teams and our community housing partners. You know, we want to work in partnership with our communities. We do managed moves. We move alleged perpetrators, and that's something that 10 years ago I'd have been laughed at if we had suggested doing that. We bring together those multi-agency meetings to try and find a solution to the issue. And we're in the process of reducing our patch sizes by increasing the number of our community housing partners so we can work more intensively with people. Our local authority partners are very supportive, but they are incredibly stretched. Even previous ASB isn't the barrier it once was, and we don't have kind of an exclusions panel any longer, and we're now housing people we never would have agreed to 5 years ago. Has this approach been hard? Yes. Is it resource intensive? Yes. Have our housing teams been fully receptive? Not always, if I'm honest. It's a learning curve. But we've had support from our board and our exec team to try something different. I may be a lone voice in the room or not, but the recommendation I struggle with is codifying that evictions into homelessness into law. I think the cultural change that has taken place over the last few years demonstrates that for the vast majority of social landlords, eviction is the last resort, and we really mean the last resort. I never came into this profession wanting to evict anyone, but there will be occasions, and it is rare, very rare, that it will have to be a possibility when we have exhausted all other avenues, and particularly when we are working under the pressures and with the funding that we already have at the moment. And also, we have to consider the significant, we have to consider the harm that is causing to the perpetrator, but sometimes that significant risk that is posed to our communities and to our staff working within those communities. I think the will is there, but for us and our other partners, we need more support, we need more funding, we need more resources to get where we want to be and where our communities need us to be. Diolch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much indeed for inviting me along today. Really grateful, it's a pleasure to be here at this fantastic event. And I'm also grateful to Shelter for offering me personally the opportunity to feedback on the report from its earlier stages. You know, and obviously come here today to talk about the policing review, really, in terms of much of the report's content and homelessness generally. I think it's an excellent report. I think largely the position of policing in Wales, who I'm here representing, is very supportive of the report and its aspirations and objectives. I think it's pleasing to see trauma-informed approaches being mentioned throughout the fabric of the report so often. It mirrors really the heart of a lot of work Chief Constables across Wales and Commissioners have been looking at for a number of years and taking forward in a variety of areas. So that's really pleasing. I think we all agree that a multi-agency, properly funded, problem-solving approach is what's important here and what's needed in terms of this particular problem. Tackling the needs and issues that are really complex in some of the tenants across Wales isn't a simple solution, but it needs all of us working together to achieve that, and we recognise that. And I think the report has that in abundance, really. So that is really sort of our position, speaking on behalf of policing in Wales. And in fact, homelessness itself is an issue that has been debated and discussed and a real concern for policing, and it has been for some time. Only last year in the Partnership Policing Board, where Welsh ministers, officers, commissioners, chief constables attended, there was a common agreement, if you like, amongst all attendees that the needs and the vulnerabilities of tenants and victims should be at the forefront, really, of our approach. And I think that came through strong in that, and also was equally strong was the view around the need to repeal the Vagrancy Act, 200-year-old legislation which is simply not fit for purpose, and the impact that was having as well on our response and the response of partners. So, it fits a theme, really, where this particular issue is really pertinent to policing at the very highest level. It's subject to frequent discussions, as I've just alluded to. And it's interesting to Jonathan's point around antisocial behaviour and the labels that gives people. Jonathan obviously articulated the definition. The challenge for us, as you know, is that we're non-devolved and we have to, adhere to the Home Office and report back to them and deal with antisocial behaviour differently. I think we've fed back that in terms of the repealing of the actual phrase itself. So it is a challenge for us. However, we do understand it's quite broad, and it does range from, as Jonathan said, drug dealing, antisocial behaviour, and I particularly like the line in the report about somebody's cheese and wine party is somebody else's antisocial behaviour, which leads to the perception issue you discussed, Jonathan, which is a really important note as well. Having said that, despite the government's obvious focus on antisocial behaviour generally, they've just launched the action plan and a subsequent toolkit, and indeed South Wales Police, where I work, is one of pilot forces to tackle ASB through hotspot policing. So it is on the Westminster government's agenda for us. But notwithstanding that, I think our position is enforcement should be the last resort, when all other options have been explored. You know, it's about a balance for us as a policing service in understanding the needs of individuals, the trauma they've experienced. And our position is very much one of we should not be criminalising individuals for trauma they've experienced, adversity they faced, or health issues such as mental health that they're experiencing. And that is a really important thing for me to articulate today. That said, we do have a responsibility to the wider community in the way we tackle and deal with antisocial behaviour to keep our community safe. So for Policing in Wales, it is indeed a balance. But just wanted to reassure all delegates here today that our primary focus is not to forget or indeed ignore the adversity and the trauma that has been experienced by many tenants. And our view would be that it has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, you know, whereby officers at the front line going into houses and homes understand that it isn't just about enforcement, it's about what are the issues impacting on this person's behaviour and how can I signpost to that person for that person to get the appropriate help. And that is an ongoing training issue for us across Wales that we take very, very seriously indeed. And even if enforcement is utilised, then we would always look for some form of supportive mechanism within that. And if we can go down the route of a restorative approach or mediation or some aspect, that would be much more you know, beneficial for the individual and obviously an avenue we would like to explore. I'm not going to touch on mental health, as Jonathan alluded to. It's within almost every other page in the report, rightly so, and everyone's aware of the challenges that you know, offers all of us and our communities. In relation to the report itself, we welcome the recommendation for new guidance. I think it's long overdue. I think 2009, I think the guidance was referred to, and then refreshed 2014. So clearly that needs an update. And what I would also hopefully provide, because again, it's a consistent theme throughout the report, is consistency and the ability to share good practice. So it becomes widespread and mainstreamed instead of isolated pockets of good work. You know, so I think that is something we really, really welcome. And again, the importance with that is training and support for social landlords to be able to sustain tenancies through that particular preventative approach. But again, keyword, funding is obviously an issue. Obviously, devolution is an issue for us in terms of policing, as we touched upon. But I think as Jonathan has already alluded to, and Jen, around, there are some excellent examples where that is not a barrier. The will is there operationally to work together, and there's some fantastic examples, blueprints in Wales of work with female offenders, with youth justice, that we would look to utilise that blueprint for, and the aspiration indeed is there to do that within this landscape. And finally, on a personal note, I do think that some of the recommendations are really, really excellent. I particularly liked the idea of a personal housing plan where individuals' needs and concerns and vulnerabilities are discussed before allocation of premises, and there's almost an agreed pathway to support that person. I think that's really, really good and positive. I think the monitoring of evictions, excuse my colloquial terminology, is a no-brainer. To fully understand and have an evidence base to intervene at an appropriate time, I think that's also really important. But overall, we are very receptive and supportive to many of the recommendations in the report for policing in Wales. I just want to finish really on one of the lines from Robert Peel in 1829, you know, which refers to policing generally, and the test of efficiency for policing specifically is the absence of crime and not the visible response to it. And in this context, I think the test, not necessarily of efficiency, but of success for us all, is the absence of ASB-related evictions into homelessness. And I think that's an objective we in Policing in Wales are really, really keen to contribute and work towards. Thank you.
I'm going to be reflecting predominantly on the mental health recommendations in the report. I think my two colleagues have touched on the other areas really, really thoroughly. First of all, we were delighted to be consulted and be part of this really important piece of work. I think it's a really timely piece of work and a real challenge to the way everyone is working and thinking about antisocial behaviour, but lots of things across kind of housing and homelessness policy. Obviously, Platform really welcome the push for a more trauma-informed approach, the move away from victim-focused only punitive processes and process-driven ways of working, acknowledging partnership working and a move to relationships. It has to be fundamental to everything. Being trauma-informed is all about relationships, but it's hugely complex, as has been said, and it requires support and solutions that speak to that complexity. Being trauma-informed is really hard. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of investment, and it pushes and challenges the way our systems are configured and set up. Often we parachute in individualised interventions, and we don't have space or time to think about the whole system. It's no surprise that the mental health of perpetrators is highlighted, as we know people's mental health is much poorer in areas of poverty, of deprivation, where there's inequality, where there are high prevalence of adverse childhood experiences and adverse community experiences. So if we really want to get to the root of this issue, we must go upstream. We must work out why people are falling in the river, not just pulling them out at the end. We're really passionate about reframing the narrative. Language is so powerful, as has already been said, and we need to move towards needs-led interventions, not label-driven interventions. When we understand mental health in its simplest form as being nervous system overwhelm and a loss of connection to the self, others and the world, we then understand that behaviour as communication of those unmet needs, our response is much different. We need to move away from approaches that blame, shame and punish individuals, which perpetuate challenges and alienate people from services. People need to be heard, people need to be validated for their experiences and their feelings. And we also need to acknowledge that there is burnout and overwhelm across the whole system, so it's not just about those individuals who are perpetrating antisocial behaviour, experiencing overwhelm, toxic stress and all of that. The challenges that people experience is also being experienced across housing, health, social care sectors, and our responses to those individuals working in those systems needs to also be compassionate and have empathy and seek to repair and build relationships. What I'd also like to say is that you can't be trauma-informed without whole organisational culture, practice and policies reflecting that approach. It's not just a one-off training course, it's not a one-off piece of work, it takes an emotional toll, and it's never done, it's never finished, it's a way of being, it's not a way of doing. And that is really, really tough because it pushes against other challenges. We've had those experiences ourselves, and we're not perfect, and we're still learning, and that's the part of the process, really, isn't it? But if you think about how does trauma-informed impact on your HR policies and practices, what does your approach to staff, that needs to mirror our approach to how we support people in the community. It has to be across the board, because we're all human. We also really welcome the reference to the mental health strategy and housing being seen as a mental health intervention. But I think it needs to go further than that. It is about housing, but it's also about communities. It's about people's access to opportunities, schools, wider support networks. It isn't just about housing in of itself. It's about financial stability and our ability to have meaningful relationships with people around us. And we need to move away from it being about referring on to specialist interventions and look more to a holding on approach, as was highlighted in the NEST model from Welsh Government. It's not all about access to specialist mental health interventions, but it is about giving teams and staff working across the sector the skills to be able to effectively support people at times of distress. So it's about coming alongside health and social care and housing support workers in the third sector with psychological support and interventions so that we can support staff who are doing that work. As I said, it doesn't need to be often a mental health specialist that does that work. It's about coming alongside people, working not in a doing to way, but a doing with way. We organise our systems, as I said, around individualised interventions. So it's not just about more counselling or access to specific specialist services. There is a role for those services, and when people are in crisis, obviously they need to access them. But we often don't do the foundation work to ensure people feel safe and regulated and stable to be able to then meaningfully engage with those mental health services. So that's why about having more investment and time for support workers and the skills for them to be able to come alongside people in those times of distress. I would just like to finish with the quote, "It takes a village." It's about whole community responses to these challenges, not just kind of specialist intervention. Thank you.
everything they said. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm very aware of time, and I imagine we need caffeine and sugar now. So very seriously, I think you were looking over my shoulder when I wrote this. So not unsurprisingly, we've worked Roots and Shoots with platforms, so a lot of what I'm going to say is exactly the same as what Sarah just said. So for us, I think the solution is relationships first, and really believing that relationships are the agents of change, and the relationship is the intervention, and that's mirrored in the time we're being given to do that. Because what we're hearing, we work with more than 30 housing providers across the whole of Wales, is there's that rub, isn't there? You've got the potential, you're in tables, you're being monitored for all your outcomes, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. We're still in recovery and crisis after COVID. And what goes at those points of pressure is our values-based practice and the time to have that relational engagement. And I'm going to flip my notes the other way around, actually, because of what Sarah just said. Because actually, I want to begin with, what about the staff who work in housing support? I couldn't do, this is fabulous, fantastic. I am thinking of Sarah, Sean, Sianed, who have got a waiting list like this. Maybe they've got 600, not 250 on their patch. So actually, I think we need to begin with walking the talk, definitely across systems, but beginning with restoring our staff first. I think that's absolutely essential. And it's not rocket science, but it's about being restorative and trauma-informed in our HR, like Sarah just said, in the day-to-day way that we work with our peers, with other agencies, and that consistent relational restorative practice for us as well, because trauma sticks. We're much more involved in workplace mediation in social housing providers because we are at the end of our tether. There is compassion fatigue, there's exhaustion. So this is great when we're in a good place, okay? So I think don't forget that what we're talking about is about staff and restoring ourselves first. And so that trauma-informed and restorative isn't just a sticky plaster over a broken system. We need to practice what we preach, really support each other with restorative supervision as well, and allowing time for that recovery. And having those open, transparent conversations internally. That needs clear leadership at all levels of leadership across Wales. And I'm a leader, I'm a chief executive. It means we need to model the behaviours we want in others, particularly under pressure when we're stressed. Where are those lovely values and mission statements on the front page of our website when we're, it's December the 21st, it's pitch black, I'm knackered, I've got 12 reports to write. So actually I model breathing, looking after myself, involving people, delegating well, reflecting on relationships internally and externally, and really writing what I can do as a leader is get it into job descriptions, contracts, caseloads, practices, processes, and policies. We talk about relationships policy and really ditching the labels in our language internally and externally so that we're not punishing staff for when we are at the end of our tether as well. Really human, compassionate system, like Sarah said. So just a few highlights. Sarah said it all already, really, which is wonderful to hear. We're all on the same page here. So we need to be serious and strategic about trauma-informed and restorative. It's not that thing we do when everything's gone wrong and we've tried everything else. Really focus on the relationship first. There's absolute robust evidence, both in restorative practice, restorative justice, and trauma-informed practice, that the relationship is the intervention. You get that right, you get out of the office, you get walking around the streets. In COVID, I'm wondering that statistic, which is amazing. Well done, everybody here, for keeping on. 72% reduction. In COVID, we were more relational. We picked up the phone more. Even if we couldn't physically see people, we were on the streets, we were knocking doors, we had to work multi-agency, hyper-local. We were strengths-based, and we relied on neighbourhoods. So I'm really, really keen on asset-based working as well. So I'm wondering if we're at risk of losing that. So this is a great reboot about actually what did work in COVID really well. We looked after ourselves better. We were doing webinars on restorative well-being every week, which was wonderful, wonderful. I'm wondering if we're losing that focus if we're not careful. So keep high support and high challenging careful balance, especially under pressure, because you don't need to evict. You don't need to go to punitive sanctions, like Sarah was saying. You can use restorative approaches at the extreme levels to avoid court as an out-of-court disposal. I used to be an environmental health officer, by the way, in housing, and work very closely with police. You can still be restorative, and oh my goodness, the reduction in human cost. Nobody feels good doing an eviction, like Natalie was saying. Nobody goes into housing going, oh, I can't wait to do a sanction on someone. That's not why we're here. That's not our core values. So we've seen, you know, like I said, 30 housing providers, local authorities and social landlords and private landlords who want to walk the talk in their values. So that lovely mission statement you've got, especially under pressure when everything else has gone, it's never above the law. Restorative approaches is never above the law. I couldn't agree with you more. Sometimes for community safety. I worked in Cardiff Prison for 12 years. The most traumatised people cause the most harm, okay, often. We do need an outcome. Can I reassure you that restorative approaches is pink and fluffy, it is emotionally literate, and it's got teeth, okay? So we do expect behavioural change, we do expect no more harm, but we do it trauma-informed and compassionately with everybody affected being involved in the decision-making. And just to finish with a phrase that Sarah used, we are passionate about working with, not doing 2 or 4 people, strengths-based. Those who are affected by a problem are best placed to resolve it. So if you are interested in working with us, we'd like to talk to you, but I think it's a fantastic, fantastic reminder about what works. So thank you very much, Shelter.
I'm afraid I'm going to make myself hugely unpopular now because I'm going to squeeze our coffee break to allow for a few questions to our panel. So please, can you indicate from the delegates in the room and online as well? Any questions? Yes. It's on the way.
Hello. Oh, it's really loud. Hi, I'm Hannah from the Mental Health Mind, the mental health charity. And I've got an observation and a really quick question. My observation was, I think before coming here, was that I felt like, regards to homelessness, people were working quite independently to tackle it. So it's quite nice to come to a conference like this where there's actually quite a lot of people from different sectors coming together and, working on kind of tackling homelessness together. My question, I have written it down because I don't want to waffle. So this is kind of a question through maybe from the police sector, from housing. When you do get clients or members of the public approaching you on how homelessness has affected their mental well-being and maybe have current mental health issues but not in crisis, do you just signpost them, or are you actually linked up with mental health services or charities like Platform or Mind to intervene on your behalf if it's past your remit? That's my question. To anyone?
I think from a policing perspective, we would probably signpost, if I'm honest. I think it's quite, evident. You may have seen nationally there's a piece of work which is now being rolled out called Right Care, Right Person, which originated in Humberside, which recognised that police officers aren't necessarily the best people to deal with some of the real complex challenges that members of the public have around mental health. So we would look to signpost to those who are better placed to offer that support, which we do frequently and daily. But we don't necessarily work in tandem or in partnership with a specific mental health charity or group. But our view would be, our process, if you like, would be to signpost who could offer the best possible help, dependent on their individual circumstances. And I'll leave it open to colleagues to complete the answer.
So I suppose we do a bit of both. We will signpost, but then we will pick up that phone and ring round to different agencies, try to find who is the best person or the best agency possible to support, to support that individual. Give an example. Lockdown 2020, Christmas Eve, there was a customer who was in significant crisis who had been causing antisocial behaviour, and it had got escalated through to myself. He was pleading for help, and I was at home on the end of the phone to him, not the best person to support that person in any way, shape or form. So, it was, again, what Julia said, trying to build up that relationship with, first of all, for me to say, I need to put the phone down, I need to find the best support for you, but for him to trust me that I was going to ring him back and say, I can't help you, but I can find somebody that I can, and that took a long time on Christmas Eve, as well, to be able to do that. So yeah, we do a bit of both.
There's lots of really good examples of different agencies working together. Co-location of teams works really well. So Platform have got a number of mental health, homelessness, housing specialists who are based in housing options departments. So if someone comes into a local authority and they've got a housing issue and there are obviously mental health distress, then our teams will go and speak to them, so they are specifically trained in how to respond to someone who's in acute distress, whether that's feeling suicidal or psychotic, and we can then have direct links into community mental health teams and crisis referral pathways. And then also, there's that cross-pollination of knowledge that happens, so our teams can learn from and work alongside housing and homelessness officers, understand the pressures that those roles and those individuals are facing in meeting that housing need, but then also we can support those professionals in understanding the mental health needs of that person and how to best prioritise them for their kind of, to meet their duty. So that works really well. There's other examples and things that came out of things like the Crisis Care Concordat about where who's best placed to support somebody at a time of crisis. So we've, Cardiff and Vale Health Board have just commissioned a sanctuary service, for example, in Cardiff, and that's going to be an out-of-hours open access place where people can go and access support rather than be a burden for police and resources and then somebody needing to go into custody, for example, to keep themselves safe. Or rather than going to A&E, which is also not appropriate for a lot of people, they can go and visit the sanctuary, and there's a couple of them across Wales now. And often people's crisis is practical stuff. It's financial, it's housing related, it's a row at home, it's kids. It doesn't need to go on to these statutory services, but it does need someone to sit with them who can come alongside them, listen, be empathetic, and work out a plan of what they're going to do to make it better.
Yeah, just to echo, multi-agency, very local, very co-located, because sometimes, what if I haven't got access to IT, a mobile, I need somebody walking distance who I can actually pop into. Fantastic model I've seen recently in Ely, in Cardiff. It's an area similar to the areas we work in. And people, not programs, help people. Like you say, it's not the complicated things, but the final straw that pushes you over the edge. And there, it welcomes people just coming out of prison, returning home to their community, looking at how does the community receive back men from prison and their families. And peer working is really fantastic there. So we've trained peer mentors to be restorative listeners themselves, but people from services are there on certain days at a time that's accessible. But you haven't got to be a therapist to be therapeutic, actually. And I think that, very local, first contact with someone, anyone, who just listens first, I think. And then as fast as you can, if there is a specialist need, accessible as possible. And if there is a waiting list, being honest about it, because sometimes we signpost in hope going, but if you've got people locally, they know that, you can tell the person, look, I'm here for you now. In 6 weeks, we know that, but there are waiting lists like this, aren't there? So hyper-local, peer where possible, anybody, better than nobody, and listen first.
And if I can come back, thanks to you, if I can come back to the policing aspect, I didn't want to give the impression that we would just say, go and ring so-and-so and walk away. We would obviously submit referrals, and signpost professionally, have those conversations with our partners and professionals with the objective of providing the best possible support. Clearly, it would be based on the individual circumstances. So from the extreme, we would potentially have to detain somebody under the Mental Health Act to just simply offering support and guidance through our appropriate partners. So just to clarify, it's not a case of, just go and ring so-and-so and we walk away. It's not that. It's just obviously policing isn't necessarily the best agency to deal with some of the complex challenges that person might have.
Thank you all. Can you please join me in thanking our panel? So we will now break for tea and coffee, which is served in 2 areas. It's in the main lobby, but also the exhibition room, and please visit the exhibits. We will then head straight into our first breakout session, and immediately after that will be lunch. And if I can remind you that we have the Energy Safety Fringe, hosted by our main sponsors, Walesden West Utilities, which will be in the last half hour of the lunch break. And then we will head into the second breakout session. And then if I can ask you, please, to promptly be back here by 3:05 for the plenary session. As you can see, we've got a very packed agenda this afternoon. Please continue the conversations over the breaks. And I'm sure panel members and speakers will be more than happy to talk to you if you've got any further questions offline. Thank you all very much. See you later.